This is workshop number 3, Guiding Project-Based Learning Development, Interactions, Coached Ideation, and Assessment Basics. Again, I'm R.Whitehead, CELT Faculty Fellow for High Impact Practices and Associate Professor of Architecture. Today I'm going to walk you through a few of these different ways in which we can actually continue on with our previous work with project-based learning, look at the different phases that we're getting into now, and the important stages in which we're able to give feedback to students to develop and enhance the process. So what makes project-based learning so hard to teach? Take a look at this quote, and I think this really summarizes quite a bit. Rule number 1, as you know, is to trust the creative process. So rule number 2, just do your best. The design, the delivery, and the assessment parts of project-based learning are all unique to other conventional, more traditional ways of teaching. Now, in the previous lectures, we've of course described why this is beneficial not just for students, but for instructors as well. We know that it improves retention, we know it improves engagement. All this hard work is, without a doubt, 100% worth it. But it's important to know here that to do project-based learning, we have to change how we design our course, how we deliver our course, and what we'll talk about today too, how we assess the course. So as we begin today, let's look at the main questions that we have. As you can see here, of course, these are the project-based learning properties by the former Buck Institute, now called PBL Works. In this, we talked about all the different properties that it normally has. So our questions for today, if we look at, say, sustained inquiry as one of the key properties for project-based learning, how do we sustain it? Another key property, student voice and choice. How is that directed in a productive manner? And then the aspects of it where we have critique and revision and even reflection. One of the questions that we'd have is, how can critique and revision lead to better reflection? All of these things, all of the answers to this essentially fall under the umbrella of formative assessment and feedback. Formative assessment is an ongoing, flexible, and more informal diagnostic tool. Summative assessment is, as the word implies, an evaluation of the sum product of the lesson. Summative assessments, in other words, may be more formal, structured, or standardized as a way to sort of normalize performance so they can be measured and compared. Whereas formative, because they are more ongoing and flexible and more informal, they happen more frequently, and there's less sort of direct standards in which you're able to compare one to another. In other words, it's perfectly arranged. Formative feedback is perfectly arranged in order to have a targeted, sustained inquiry, in order to promote particular student voice and choice, and in order to provide the critique and revision needed, so the student reflection work is right on track. We always like to do this sort of map in terms of where we are within the project-based learning process. As you might remember, in workshop number 1, we planned the course. We started with either a series of guiding questions, learning goals, partners, scheduling. Remember also in the first one, we looked at a backwards design process in which we tried to imagine what the artifact or the evidence might be. In workshop number 2, we learned about how to scaffold the course, how to make sure that we're working through there with a series of deadlines and activities, breaking down the different modules, what we hope to accomplish at each of the modules. And then we did some in-class exercises in which we were able to look at how we'd be able to do this discovery or empathy part of the project. Now here we are at this area where we've been able to have them expand their thoughts through this discovery. Now we want to be able to, if we finish that module and that delivery process, now we want them to be able to narrow those thoughts down. Still focused on what the overall problem is, but being able to narrow them down by either interpreting or defining what the characteristics of their project really are. In order to do that, of course, they need targeted feedback. I like this graphic quite a bit. I think it really helps us because in this particular graphic, again, we see the sort of expansion, contraction, as each phase of either a design thinking or project-based learning project proceeds. But with this one, what I like is that underneath that particular category, in this case, define, It shows you different tactics that might be able to be used, different ways of challenging students to, in this case, interpret their finding or find meaning or identify themes, or even artifacts of telling stories or defining insights or framing their opportunities. So as we're looking at one of the other questions we hope to answer today, how do we help them narrow these choices, and who defines the problem to be defined? Right? What tactics then are useful to do so? These are some general guidelines that will allow you to work your way through some of those particular options. Finally, the last set of questions that we hope to address in this particular workshop has to do with this graphic that we presented at the last workshop. In this graphic, it demonstrates that it's not just one project-based learning or design thinking process that happens. In fact, that we're intending to have different student teams take a different trajectory, and that those trajectories are meant to be a bit divergent from each other. So then the question is, how do we then keep a regular schedule and deadlines and deliverables for this? The concentric circles there are different ends of phases and the modules. You can also see through the middle that this is related to the overall higher learning objectives of understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So the idea is, how do we define what those concentric rings are? How do we keep the divergence that we want in order that the student voice and choice is nurtured, but keeping them all on track to what we see at the end there is the larger golden rectangle where you have the final project proposals and the larger common purpose. Assessment needs to be able to account for, even though your schedule has created these modules, these concentric ring modules, a targeted type of formative assessment allows this divergence of paths to happen and is able to give key input at those particular locations for each group so they can either continue on that path or, as you can see from the gray arrows here, they either continue on or find a way to revise and go back, and revise and go back. So how do we do this? I wish I could tell you that this is easy, but honestly it isn't. I wish I could tell you that there's a particular formula for making this work, but as you know, good teaching never has one particular formula. What I can tell you is teaching and good teaching and project-based learning, it's a practice, and it gets easier once you find tactics that are useful. So again, we look at our larger set of project-based learning, or in fact just good teaching or active learning tactics that are up here. And I would just ask you, as you're thinking about formative assessment, is that each one of these teaching tactics is a way of being able to give assessment in different ways. You're asking them to engage in the project, then you're giving them feedback. These are all really about communication. So as you approach this and as you incorporate some of these tactics that we've been dealing with throughout the workshops, I want you to remember that you yourself are not the sole source for both information and or motivation. Your role as an instructor here is to instill long-term learning goals within this method. You're a facilitator in this one. So recall the benefits then of why we're doing project-based learning, because then I think you'll be able to see how this feedback could be most useful. The term active construction, as you remember, in active construction, a learner actively constructs meaning based on experiences and interaction with the world, versus what some might say is like a superficial learning when information is passively transmitted. The second part of it, situated learning. In this case, the learning is situated within an authentic or real-world context of some sort. Students then can see the value and meaning of the tasks and activities they perform, both to themselves and the benefits to their community. So in other words, the knowledge and skills that they're learning matter. Third one, social interaction. In this one, teachers, students, and community members all work together in a situated activity to construct a shared understanding through socialization. You can see here, of course, active construction, situated learning, and social interaction are all about trying to instill that this is important, it's authentic, it means something. It's a way of being able to turn that learning inward, which brings us to the last one of metacognition. Metacognition or other cognitive tools. These are tools and practices that encourage students to learn how to learn. These particular tools can amplify how students learn by enhancing either the visualization of things, either the visualization of data, or physical properties of things with like haptic learning, hands-on things, or they can range from computer simulations and active learning processes. And so what you find with these PBL teaching tactics is that these are all formative assessment techniques that can be flipped in a particular manner so that they tap into active construction, situated learning, social interaction, under the sort of broader umbrella of metacognition. Think about how you could target some of these tactics within some of these scenarios. What tactic would be most useful during the discovery phase, or the ideation phase, or the experiment phase? What I would tell you is that there are some student teams in which backwards design maybe is a great tactic, asking them to try to imagine what the end result would be and asking them to work backwards from there. Others may struggle and need some just-in-time teaching. For sure, teams will always need a coached ideation. Of course, this relates quite a bit to a guided discovery process as well. And later in the lecture, we're going to see different ways of being able to have some cooperative learning, even a shared solution, or perhaps even a role-playing evaluation as well. Now, I've shown these diagrams through several of our different workshops, and I think that they're good reminders about why we're trying to teach this way, and I guess why feedback and assessment is so important in project-based learning. Remember, we want it to be ongoing and flexible and a little more informal. Formative assessment is intended to improve teaching and learning while it's happening. So if you look at, say again, the Kolb model here, formative assessment allows us to create exercises in which there's either concrete experiences or reflective observations. We can ask them to go from either thinking and doing to feeling and watching, to feeling and doing, to thinking and watching. These may not be things that students will just do on their own. Oftentimes I've found that it takes prompts, it takes particular exercises, and these exercises maybe shouldn't always just be about thinking and doing. It could be about feeling and doing. So trying to find a way that you have exercises and tactics, even feedback, that allows you to then get them to move all the way around the Kolb model. And of course, as we know in the higher order thinking of the Bloom taxonomy, that the idea here is to be able to go up, up, up with a higher order thinking. And ideally then we go down, up and down and up and down and up and down multiple times. And in order to go up and down multiple times, you can see the role of feedback in doing that. Asking them to remember and understand things is great because we ask them to apply it. But by being able to give them feedback, we ask them to both evaluate and maybe recreate it, do something different, have a revision. Asking them what they think about something asks them to analyze. So their analysis, of course, is related to this other level of understanding. Now, I'd say one of the things that I often find in project-based learning that's difficult from an assessment point of view is that there's this question of project-based learning intended to be slightly more open-ended in terms of what the project is, what's being searched for, what's being uncovered. And so the question I often hear is from instructors is, well, if I recognize the benefit of interdisciplinary work, and I also recognize the value of somewhat more open student-led research, but I really need to make sure that there's some disciplinary specific knowledge and skills. How do I make sure that it can remain interdisciplinary a bit in terms of its scope? How can I make sure that there's student voice and choice? But how can I make sure that it comes back to the objectives that I've established for the course? My answer, assessment. Over and over and over. You define assessment. You define the type of assessment. So let's go back over to the chart on the right. Assessment. You could be asking them to interpret their findings, or ask them to identify themes, or ask them to tell stories. All of these things in this particular phase are different means of assessment, and these means of assessment can be made more specific to your discipline. As you're considering ways to be able to develop these different assessment models, it's important to acknowledge that most classes are a combination of all of these types of teaching methods: the learner-centered, the teacher-directed, or something that's more content-specific. Different situations may call for a particular delivery system. Oftentimes, all of these things have their own teaching ethic associated with them, where you may find that a learner-centered approach is ideal because it's more open, or a teacher-directed approach allows for more yes or no, or right or wrong answer. Same thing with the content-specific delivery. Do you know how to do this particular skill? Do you have this knowledge, yes or no? But what the project-based learning process of formative assessment allows you to do is it creates a different hybrid system, one that at its core has a different ethic, and this ethic then is what's in red. The ethic is something that's mutually beneficial. The goal would be to establish a collaborative and a cooperative teaching method. We're not looking at just simply transactional learning. I want this from you. You want this from me. And in this case, though, we want the instructor to be invested in the project's success and learning. You're a facilitator, and as a facilitator, you need to make sure that your interest is also seeing the project's success. The role of assessment in PBL really should be this mutually beneficial approach. Assessment, as you know, helps just to determine how much or how little is known compared to certain expectations. And in project-based learning, we know that it has to be ongoing. We know it has to be formative. We know it has to be mutually beneficial. The other thing I would say is it really does rely on an interpersonal, robust, and authentic assessment in various forms. Now, big caveat here, I know this is not always possible. I know there are big classes, I know there's online formats, and I know that you may see impediments to this. But let me point out this picture on the right. This is undergraduate structure class of 90 plus students. They worked in teams of 2 or 3. The assignment that was given to them was a project-based learning, actually more of a problem-based learning approach, in which they were asked to build a bridge and construct a bridge based on certain design and structural standards. So they were supposed to design it, build it, and then test it. So I guess what I would say is, in this particular scenario, we designed the class and we designed the problem itself and the feedback method here to allow them to get formative feedback as they're designing it, as they're building it, and finally as they were testing it here. And this is a very large class, so it is possible. We knew that this particular way of being able to test it was both present it, I should say, and assess it in a public setting was an essential aspect of the success of the project-based learning approach. The pros and cons of doing assessment in project-based learning versus traditional, I think, are relatively straightforward. So in project-based learning, we may see it as a slightly more open-ended, you're not exactly sure what feedback you're going to give to the students until you see the project and the process of where they are. Versus in a more traditional class, the means of assessment is pretty much straightforward. It's a project versus a test. You could have to plan for more open-ended exploration that you'll have to give feedback for. You have to be a little more agile on your feet. You have to be able to meet them where they are and give the feedback that they need. Versus essentially having the same expectations. All of you need to be able to do this exercise and that exercise in the same way. Sometimes we crave the right versus wrong way of doing assessment. No, that's not correct. Redo it until you get it right. But project-based learning ends up more of like a good, better, best. And a good, better, best can be difficult to articulate the difference between. As a practitioner, I often find that to me it might seem pretty obvious what's a good design project versus a better design project versus one of the best. But trying to distinguish and trying to articulate the difference of those and communicate those to students oftentimes becomes a lot more difficult. Certainly more difficult than if it was just, no, that's the wrong size for the beam. Soft skills then are built around this particular knowledge and how that knowledge is gained. And I think that's one of the best ways of the assets then of project-based learning. And of course, the mutually beneficial approach versus maybe perhaps the more either learner-centered or teacher-centered approach makes everybody more invested in the results. So now that we've talked a little bit about the big picture of why or what we could accomplish out of this, let's talk a little bit more about how to actually set up the framework to allow this to occur. When you're doing these objectives, it's important to set up both the aims and means, the objectives and the assessment process. In this case, I'm showing you a project that was a design build project of some graduate students, my co-teacher Shelby Doyle several years ago. In this, the goal was to work with a local nonprofit to design and construct a community shelter. So how would we put this in a course syllabus? No is the wrong answer. We could not just say, your goal is to help with a design build project, because there's no actual objectives in there. So instead, what we tried to do was identify what the student must learn, what they must understand. So we said an architecture design build studio requires students to get information about materials, assembly, methods, and etc. In other words, we were trying to articulate a lot more about what they must understand. And here's the other key part about a project-based learning setup, identify what the student must do, what their ability is to complete the task. So, as an extension of the understanding, then we would say, and each student must create construction drawings of one detail, fabricate a portion of the assembly offsite, and review code compliance in the field. So students then looking at it, compare what is written in red to just the idea of help with a design build project. Now they're able to say, what do I have to learn? And then what do I need to do to demonstrate that I've learned that? Now, when you get into this slightly more open-ended project-based learning assessment, a couple of things always come up, especially when a student has had more traditional assessment, traditional courses throughout the rest of their education. Trust me, it's going to happen right off the bat. Student will say to you, could you just tell me what I'm supposed to do? Like, I'm confused about what you want. Okay, so in one case, you'll have somebody who just wants to know what the answer is and wants you to help them find the answer. On the opposite end of it, you're going to have students say things like, I didn't want to do what you told us to do, so I just went and did something completely different. So what you're going to find is, on one side you have this sort of compliance with tell me about how to do something in line with the more traditional approach, and the other side, which is, I'm really going to try to embrace this overall open-ended freedom, but I want to break all the bounds and constraints of the learning objectives. Whereas internally, what you have to deal with is this idea that you have specific learning objectives that need to be met. So how can both of these approaches, this sort of traditional tell me what to do approach and this open-ended part, also be acceptable within your course? My answer to this is, of course, it's never all or nothing. Both of these perspectives from the students are incorrect. And it is still your class. You understand the larger learning objectives to this. The project-based learning model, every aspect of it is centered around the core learning objectives for the course. These are things that you understand. You understand better than anybody else. Now, you may need some experience to understand the motivation behind why the students have made those particular statements. And when you're dealing with a mutually beneficial classroom setup, you want to explain to them that both of you are in this together. So later we're going to look at some other particular tactics. When we're in this define category, now that, say, you've allowed them to expand their ideas, you've had a module that's been done, they've delivered something, and now you want them to maybe refine and define their ideas a little bit more. I usually start with this idea that, okay, given this context that you, the student or the student group, have proposed, how would you, so you're asking them in black here to define or summarize their insights. So I might ask, so what have you found? Whenever I approach a student in a student group working on a project, I'll say, What have you been up to? What'd you draw? What have you found? As the very first question. If they start off into a different tangent, I always bring them back to this idea. Trying to define and summarize their insights is the most essential part of formative assessment because it brings a clarity to their thoughts. Once they try to define what it is that they've found, then you ask them to interpret it. So then, in order, I'll always say, well, what do you think that means? Or, that sounds interesting. I see it one way. How do you see this? In that, you ask them to interpret their findings, of course, right? Third, try to identify some sort of cogent themes between all of this. This is the part where being an expert and being a teacher and being a good facilitator is the most important. You have to be a good listener. If you ask them to define and summarize their insights and then interpret their findings, and you've been you've coached them and you've listened to them, what ties it together? I'm telling you, probably 90% of the time, I will hear, I don't know. And this is where sometimes your insight is the most helpful. Here's a connection I see. Have you ever heard of a project that does this? This reminds me of a reading that ties it together this way. Have you ever worked on this particular way? In doing so, when you help them tie it together, then they're incredibly relieved because now they see that there's actually a direction to what they've defined. There's a value to what they've done. Once you've done that, you can start to think about, okay, what's next? So the next aspect of it, I'll always talk about sorting and condensing their work. In define, we see that arrow has to come down. We have to be able to narrow these options. We can't keep expanding. So ask them to basically slice it thinner. If their topic was a gigantic loaf of bread, ask them how thin they could slice that bread. We don't need the whole loaf. We just need a slice. And then the other strategy sometimes I'll do is the 5 why questions. Well, I really wanted it to be this. Why? Well, because my research told me that this was important. Why? Because this was, and when you keep doing that strategy, you're essentially going to get to the essential why. And then before you leave the student, this direct formative feedback method, before you leave, you have to be able to frame what's next. What are you doing next? What are you going to draw? What are you going to write? What are you going to read? So if you can practice this behavior, what have you found? What does it mean? What ties all this together? Why are you doing it that way? Great. What's next? All of this thing is a great strategy then for direct formative feedback. Different approaches to the same project are going to need different assessments. As long as you have well-articulated learning objectives, you'll be able to do this same process, but with various project teams. So you'll have to focus on what all projects have to demonstrate, the concentric circles that we talked about earlier. They have to be able to demonstrate an understanding and an ability. You have certain standards for a quality of work that have to be articulated. There has to be part of it that has to do with a development process and/or effort, and communication skills and craft. We articulate these in every rubric, and all of these, of course, are related to what the deliverables are. As we get to each one of these concentric rings, we'll have a list of deliverables that have to be shown. And each of those deliverables then is judged on how the understanding and ability, the quality of that work, the development process that got them there, and overall communication skills and craft of that particular deliverable artifact. So your day-to-day work is going to be this, but the big picture work is making sure that you're always comfortable going back to this format One thing I've heard a lot of questions about is that, well, if project-based learning is meant to be a more of an open-ended process, and I'm meant to be a facilitator, do I actually still teach them? Do I just sort of make suggestions to them? And I would just say 100% you teach them. Don't ever sort of cede that. Oftentimes then, as we see here, the guided instruction tactic. It's so important to be able to say, here's my recommendation for what you can do next. That's instruction. Or they say, I don't know where to find that information. And you could say, let's look at the one up above. Have you seen or looked at this example? Have you read this particular book? Or maybe when you see a problem in the data that they've developed, you say, well, maybe you want to try to test that out again. That doesn't quite look right. In that, then, you'd be able to suggest to them that maybe there's something wrong in their process. So all of that, of course, is instruction, but in a formative feedback way. And off to the right here, these are just the sort of most important parts when you're going to do this coaching. They have to have an artifact, some sort of record of your conversations together. Now, these conversations can be online, they can be in person, they can be through email. I would suggest that you find a method that you think works the best for your class size and timing, and stick with that. Notes, sketches, Google Docs. There has to be an artifact, because this then becomes your roadmap. Talk to a team on Monday, maybe you don't see them for another week because there's lots of teams. Well, then you're really going to want to know what they thought was the most important thing, what they were supposed to have looked at, whether they actually did what was recommended, and did they produce or retest something. In that, you can also hold them accountable for who does their particular tasks and how they'll assess the work. The big picture is, this is then an educative assessment approach. This is a way in which they're learning to learn. They're learning the process. And they're learning to be held accountable to the process. So thinking of how you want to make a record of that. What have I done in the past? Oftentimes then I'll have a lecture, a lab, and a lab report. And that's the order in which we'll actually then give some information, ask them to do some work, and then have a lab report. In this, then, we transition from the teacher-centered to a mutually beneficial to then a student-led. Teacher-centered, of course, was the lecture. Mutual is the lab in which we're working with them, to the lab report, in which that's a student or learner-centered idea. In this, they were asked to actually build a series of, they actually designed a folded plate concrete structure, and they were asked to demonstrate the process that they went through. So you can see I've narrowed down this lab report quite a bit, but you can see that they took images of the process that they used, why they made the particular decisions they made, what it finally looks like, and how it was tested. This process is super important to be able to use because it allows you to assess multiple projects within one sort of rubric. Okay? What I was asking in that project had to do with asking them to learn very particular things about a type of a structure, type of materials, and ways of constructing it. Those are my sort of broader learning objectives, knowing that there were going to be a variety of different options within that. But how do I make sure that they did learn about that particular structure, material, construction? This is the secret. Put problems within a project. To go back to a distinction that we had made from a previous workshop, problem-based learning is a teacher-defined problem with a constrained range of possible solutions. Where a project-based learning might be broader-based with a series of different questions that might be asked, and then a much more open range of possible solutions. Now, I've often found that within a project-based approach, I can easily add different problems. So for instance, in the lab report, I'd ask them to talk about the geometry of the particular form. That was a problem, right? Instead of how can we introduce particular genetic strain, my question would be along the lines of, what forms were most beneficial to be able to allow a folded concrete plate structure to work effectively. Now, there's a range of possible solutions. There's not a right or wrong answer, but there's definitely a range of possible solutions. So they could be able to answer that question. And in that, they answered that question by making particular diagrams and being able to show how it was able to be built. You can do that over and over within a particular project. This is an example of a problem or a lab write-up that I did. So you can have certain open-ended options to it, but there has to be explicit instructions about technical content and deliverables. In this, I give them the overview, the goals, the teams, what activities are expected of them, and what homework, what's due. And in that, it's all based on this problem over here, this design problem. So I had to set up the problem for them, had to give them certain constraints. Within this broader sort of project was a series of problems that I articulate over here. It takes a lot of work, but once you have it defined and once you have the scope of this work figured out, then students can't just say, well, can you just tell me what to do? Because you could say, well, sure, look at the lab report. Students can't just say, I decided not to do that. I just want to do something else. Because again, that's not the assignment. The assignment has very particular deliverables and very particular questions to answer. I want you to think about when you're trying to give feedback, whether your artifact actually invites assessment or not. In teaching and architecture, of course, we have students design buildings. They have digital models of these buildings. They produce images that I can draw upon, and we can actually, it's a tangible thing that we can look at. So, for example, what you want to do is have an artifact in which would allow you to say, how can you? Can you show me how you would? How might that work? And it's not just about design. This can, of course, be a business plan. This can be a series of narrative essays. It can be a musical. It can be anything related to STEM-based projects as well. It just has to be an artifact. And here's the most important part of it. Ask them to do something, not just tell you what it's about. Well, I was thinking for my project that I might, nope, show me. And then the second part is you have to make sure that they save evidence of their progress. Your assessments then you have to hold them accountable to their progress and their responsiveness. And we had mentioned this a couple slides before, but what I wanted to show you is the way that we're able to sort of mark up the squiggly lines in orange and the other little sketches here, those are mine. Those were done that was actually just done over a Zoom phone call in which I was able to draw things and make suggestions to the student about what would need to be done next. Those were then saved and uploaded to a class folder, just as they could be on a Canvas class assignment as well. Some potential problems that might come up. If students are having trouble generating ideas, or if, for instance, the discussions are generally languishing, maybe not thriving, think about taking yourself a bit out of the role of being the person who gives answers and gives feedback. Do more of a Socratic seminar. Okay? So basically, use guiding questions or a subhead theme and ask everybody there to participate, regardless of what their project is. Students can do role-playing or brainstorming or share a solution. Okay? And in that, they just ask each other questions. Why is that? Why'd you do it this way? What's that giving you? So using the Socratic method of essentially examining a particular question, asking why, has several benefits. It takes you out of the loop of being directly in control, turns this over to a more peer-to-peer, learner-centered format, gets all the class engaged in it, and here's the thing that I've learned through my years of experience in doing it. They love to find out what other students are doing. They love to be able to see that their voice and choice matters, that what they are doing is different than everybody else. There's this notion sometimes that when we have different divergent projects within a class, that, well, I'll just deal with the divergence of it. They don't need to know what another group is doing. Wrong, 100% wrong. They love to see what other groups are doing. They, in fact, love to participate in this feedback. Is one of the best parts about project-based learning, team-based learning, in which you have divergent solutions, is getting peer-to-peer feedback. So if you're ever running short of ideas, if you're ever finding yourself a little bit down in terms of being able to give the formative assessment, turn it over to a peer-to-peer Socratic seminar. Another issue that sometimes comes up is this question of, well, I'm a specialist, and I usually teach from perhaps a teacher-centered approach, and I'm an expert in this. But what if, say, I'm doing a project that's an architecture project, but they're interested in microfinance? I don't know much about this. What am I supposed to do? So the answer here is, first, that's totally fine. There's ways that you can direct their work to make sure it still meets their overall learning objectives. But please allow them to have this different examination through other disciplines. You aren't expected to have all the answers. When you turn into a facilitator, you're not expected to solve the problem or know everything. You're expected to try to model the behavior. Oh, that's interesting. Wow, that's great. I hadn't thought of that. What resources are you using? How did you find that out? What have you learned about a microfinance system? When you do that, when you ask them to help fill in some of the gaps, you make learning more of this collaborative process. You're not diminishing their engagement in other things, but you're encouraging them. You model them this heuristic process. It's incredibly informative, because then you could say, oh, I get that. That's really interesting. How would then we apply that back to your particular project? Another assessment tactic about modeling these methods of inquiry and approach is that sometimes if they've usually only used like traditional approach to education, they might not really be aware of how to do this, how to generate ideas. So here's an approach that you might take. Concoct a range of problems, something that's relevant to your larger class theme. As we've talked about in our workshops, maybe it's the future of food. So you have a series of problems for investigation. You write them on the board or a whiteboard. You say, okay, let's all generate some ideas, some themes. Let's do it aloud as a brainstorming session. And you lead a group discussion. And you say, well, how might we approach the problem of GMOs? And then in that, you can ask them, and as you're leading it, identify the tasks, what professional considerations, next steps, etc. You might ask them to just pick a solution and ask you, yourself, to speculate about what you would do next. Ultimately, then, it helps you to better understand the difficulty of the problem too. So you can teach the process, and you teach them how to be involved with the process. Another way of doing this is to actually think about how you could model this method in a different way too. So sometimes they're going to need your help. And I think this is important. I'm showing you here an example of a student research project at WPI at Worcester Polytechnic. They had proposed solar ovens. And the student group had said, everything we've learned about solar ovens is these are sustainable food issues. They're lightweight, they're affordable, they use less energy. And then the students found out that why weren't they being used? Our proposal is this makes total sense. Why on earth isn't this being used? So going back to the instructor, it's important to you then to be able to say, well, what would you suggest? In this case, the instructor was a nutritionist, not a scientist. So he simply approached this like he would any other problem. So he asked them to sort of validate their research. Well, what makes you say that this one is effective? Or how do you know that it's not working? And so because they couldn't find any answers with this sort of second or third hand research, he asked them to buy a solar oven. Try one out. Turns out that the solar oven was heavy, cooking took a long time, and it needed constant monitoring. In other words, they answered the question for themselves. So in this case, the teacher had the experience of knowing that just reading papers about it or just looking at it was not going to be the same thing as sort of a first-hand experience. So he coached them to find out why this is and he coached them with a different problem-solving method, which I just think is an ingenious way, particularly when dealing with very difficult and tricky problems. As you're doing this, though, I want you to really think about whether these are hard skills or soft skills at a particular moment that you're trying to achieve in your feedback. In this process of defining, developing, and ideating the projects, you need to include both hard and soft skills. Students, of course, are going to learn more about researching and critical thinking by there not being a right answer. So they learn then the soft skills of being able to dig through in the research. They still have to be able to interpret the work through the lens of hard skills. So in this particular project here was a project I worked on in one of my design studios in which students were designing an elevated storage floor system for a UNHCR disaster relief tent. So I had them buy a tent and storage containers and find out from the UNHCR why there weren't typically floors within the tent. I knew that they had to ask somebody. I knew they had to buy it. I knew they had to mock it up in order to be able to sort of learn some of the reasoning why. But then the hard skills part of it is you can see some of the sketches that are up here on the right. When they designed their own particular new storage floor system, they had to apply this to very direct material and formal structural strategies. So these are diagrams of different building structures and different ways that it could be manufactured. So soft skills, how do I find the answer? Hard skills, once you have an answer, how do you actually do it? It's probably not unexpected, but you realize that you're going to have areas in which one of the potential problems is the work just doesn't meet your expectations. And because it's somewhat open-ended, then unless you're very explicit about what is meant to be produced as an artifact, then you might have a whole variety of different things. So the thing is, you have to remind them that this isn't open-ended. You have to be able to show them examples where they can find different examples, which is, of course, the case study method. Or you're going to set some discrete deadlines. Next time, try to develop this part of the project, and you can draw it, sketch it, talk about it. Give them a markup on Canvas, send them a video, etc. So then each deadline includes a deliverable, perhaps crafted for each group. So this goes back to the idea of aims and means, the idea of understanding and ability. So when something doesn't meet the expectations that you have for the particular project, you really want to make sure that you have spelled out what those expectations would be much earlier. And the last aspect I think that oftentimes comes up, which can be a major issue, not one that we're going to go into with much depth here, just has to do with the potential problems of teams and team conflicts. More often than not, this is the primary conflict in the PBL courses that I've taught. Students don't get along, they don't listen to each other, well, all the things that make teamwork not work very well. Teaching them more about open communication and doing a skill assessment, making sure you have regular updates with assigned tasks for them all, and making the task and making it about the task, not just about the people. Trying to nurture then this shared sort of intrinsic motivation to collaborate. These are important parts. This is worthy of a much longer conversation because it's not just about managing their ability to understand the skills, knowledge, production of the artifacts. It's also about how they get there and the process to get there. So ultimately, as we come to the end of this particular lecture, let's remember that it's still about this creative process. Rule number 1 was to trust the creative process, and rule number 2 was to do your best. Make sure that you're embracing this idea of being able to give feedback in a way that's both you're interested, you're passionate, you want them to succeed. All of those ways of being able to communicate that to them in a formative, regular way is going to really create this bond in which they're going to understand the mutually beneficial aspects of the class teaching objective. And when they understand that, they're really going to see them thrive with their student voice and choice, with their inquiry, with the authenticity of their inquiry, with their ability to evaluate and reflect on their work, because you're teaching them how this process works. Thanks for watching.